Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to have back on the show Noah Bookbinder, the president of CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Prior to that, he was director of the Office of Legislative and Public Affairs at the U.S. Sentencing Commission and more. Noah, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to have you on for your new report at CREW, Election Certification Under Threat, which should make the hair on everyone's back of their neck stand up. So thanks for being on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Sure, I saw this report, and CREW identifies 35 rogue election officials across the nation who already in the past refused to certify elections, and a lot of them are in power now going into 2024. So, first of all, what prompted the report? I get a sense, but I just wanted to share. What was there one thing that stood out and you go, we have to write this now? What happened? What brought this up to?
Yeah, well, so there are a couple things that happened. One is that we were looking a couple of years ago at this guy in New Mexico, Couy Griffin,
Yeah,
who was a county commissioner in New Mexico. He was on the steps of the Capitol on January 6th. He was a leader in the insurrection, and we actually represented some New Mexico residents.
I remember that.
Suing to successfully to have him removed from office for engaging in insurrection. But what we saw is that in 2022, years after that insurrection, he led an effort to fail to certify election results. And so these were some of these same people who were involved in the effort to overturn the election in 2020, who were sort of back at it again at the local level. And so that got us looking around at this stuff. And we started to realize that a lot of these folks were still in place. They were doing this in elections in 2022, 2023, sometimes primaries earlier this year, often elections of very little consequence, which kind of made it clear that this was the real purpose of this was a dry run for the fall of 2024. And we felt like it was really important to get the word out about that.
It is. And the states that you lay out here that these people were involved in: Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, two other states, not as much battleground states, New Mexico and Colorado, still important in any event. But it just jumps out at you when you see the battleground states. And can you give some examples of the people, either Arizona? I was looking at the report. I mean, there's like, what have they done in the past? And you don't have to name them, but what have they done in the past to raise your concerns that they'll do this in the presidential election? And then if you can add why that's important in terms of that little window of time we have between the election day and January 6th.
Sure. So these are folks who, some of them were people who served as fake electors for Donald Trump. They are in many cases people who sort of came out of the so-called Stop the Steal movement. So they're people who have real ties to Donald Trump's efforts to kind of deny the legitimacy of elections, and particularly any election that he doesn't win. And they have failed to certify elections in some cases. Some of them have been quite transparent about it. There have been a few of them who have said essentially, I don't really have any evidence. I just feel like there's something wrong here. And there are others who have been a little more circumspect about it. They've said things like, I have questions about chain of custody, or I'm requesting documents so that I can understand more. The problem with that is that uh, almost every state has mechanisms for challenging elections. That if you
Right.
really have evidence that there was fraud, or you think the count is wrong, you can go to court, you can go to a state election board, you can take very specific steps. County certification is not one of those steps. This is essentially a group of people whose job is to check the addition and pass it on forward. So these folks are coming in and and essentially saying we're not going to do our job, we're not going to certify this. And that creates a real risk because, as you alluded to, there's a tight time frame where you have local precincts count their votes. There's a couple of days for counties to add all that up and pass it forward. And then there's a couple of days for the state to add up all the votes in the counties and pass it forward. And then you have the Electoral College, which needs to vote
Mm-hmm.
a few weeks after the election. And a month or so after that, you have Congress, which needs to certify. And if one of those steps starts to fall, it can be very, very hard to make those next couple of deadlines. So you could have a position where state officials reach the deadline to certify the state's voting totals, but they don't have final tallies from some of the counties. And then what do? That, either they can pass along a state total which clearly is missing some pieces, which is not going to look legitimate, or they can not do it. And then what happens to the national total? So that's sort of a worst case scenario where it can really call the whole thing, put the whole thing up in the air. But even if they don't get that far, what it will certainly do is lend more fuel to people who are out there saying, we're not sure about these results. We have questions. This may not be legitimate, none of which is based in fact, and which can lead to things like what we saw on January 6, 2021.
And I'm chatting with Noah Bookbinder, the president of CREW. And, just in a nutshell, if you get to January 6th, which was the day, not just when we had the attack, but that was the day to certify the electoral college vote, that's a mandated by law that day, January 6th.
That's right.
And one of the candidates has to have 270 electoral votes on their side to be declared president. If no one gets to 270, if Trump loses and they go, well, we're able to control enough state counties here where even some blue states, which actually does matter with Colorado and New Mexico, can't certify the votes, then Vice President Harris, let's say, if she gets the votes, can't get to 270, then the House picks the next president, at least theoretically. I mean, there could be a lot of litigation to prevent that. And then it's one delegation, one vote. It's not one person, one vote. And depending how it lines up, now it might be all academic if Democrats can win the House by a margin where they control more delegations, which is a little challenging. But if Democrats could, then this backup plan's not going to work. But if they can't, this is the concern.
That's absolutely right. I mean, there really is a bit of a horror scenario where you have some officials in counties around the country, which looks pretty minor, but it has a cascading effect where it calls states into question, and then that calls the whole national result into question. The good news, I think, and this is why we put out this report, is that the law is quite clear that this is illegal. It is clear in all of the 8 states that we feature. I believe it's clear in all of the states around the country. And there are things that states can do about it. And we've seen, for instance, in Michigan, where there have been some county officials who have done this kind of thing in the past. This year, the Secretary of State and other state officials wrote letters to county election boards saying, you can't do this. You can't fail to certify. The law is clear about that. And if you do, there will be consequences. You could be charged criminally. You could be removed from your position. And that's the kind of thing that we need to see around the country. We've also seen in places like New Mexico and Nevada, where counties have failed to certify, and the state has immediately gone to court and sought and received a court order ordering the county to certify, saying the law requires that you certify. So there are things like that that can happen, and the more that state officials and the public know that this is a risk, the more everybody can be in position, hopefully, to deter this. But if you don't deter it, at least to respond quickly and effectively.
No, and it's so vitally important that you raise it now that we're not learning about these things November 5th, in that day. And they're like, no, we're not certifying. You're like, oh my gosh, these were election deniers that were there. I want to touch on the Georgia State Election Board. They made 2 decisions in the last few weeks. 5 members. 3 are clearly Trump supporters because Trump praised them by name at a rally. The one thing they did a few weeks ago, a new rule that states before certifying results, local officials may, quote, conduct reasonable inquiry that the results are a true and accurate accounting of all the votes cast in the elections. And the concern is, again, now they've created this little area where someone could say, well, I have to do a reasonable inquiry, so I'm not going to be done in time for the deadline to certify Georgia's votes. How concerning is this one?
It's extremely concerning. One of the things I was just that we were just talking about is that in a lot of these states, you have state officials who are out there saying, you can't do this, and we're going to stop you if you try. In Georgia, you have this state election board that is doing the very opposite, that's saying, we are giving our blessing to you going and saying you're not going to certify. And the law is just as clear in Georgia as it is anywhere else. It is clearly against the law. There's 100 years of case law saying that this is a ministerial duty. You're not supposed to to be actually getting into an inquiry into the result, and yet they're putting this out there, and it sounds kind of reasonable that you can conduct a reasonable inquiry. The problem is, what is a reasonable inquiry? Who decides what that is, how long it takes, and it's not allowed by the law. And so you could have county officials saying, "Oh, we're going to need a reasonable inquiry. That's going to take a couple of weeks," and that potentially throws off the entire ability of this state to certify its elections. And so that's really troubling. And as you said, the fact that Donald Trump was praising these three members of the Board of Elections by name at a rally certainly suggests there could be another motivation here. It's
Oh,
instructive that the Republican chair of the Board of Elections voted against this change and seems really troubled by it.
and then they just agreed to a new rule, which again is kind of open-ended, that it says that local election board members, if they identify a discrepancy between the ballot count and the total number of votes, no vote shall be counted from that precinct pending an investigation. And, it's like, oh, it says 4,322 votes, but we only have 4,320. Well, we have to have an investigation. Again, where does that go to? Like, if it's off by 3 votes, what kind of investigation could you do? I mean, you could throw out 3 votes, I guess, if you wanted to, but the investigation could be like, not only an audit, do you go back to every person who signed in and voted and check if they voted? I mean, these are just delaying tactics again, potentially.
That's right. I mean, and discrepancies are pretty normal when you're counting thousands of votes. Usually, if there's a recount, the totals will change by a couple of votes. These things happen. You have a process for that, which is, either in the course of the certification, essentially they can do the math again and try to make sure they're getting it right. And if it's something bigger than that, you can go to court. There's a whole other provision, but it's not this. The law doesn't provide for this. And again, this is a way that the system could be delayed. They made another change, which was allowing for document requests by county commissioners. And again, sounds pretty sounds pretty benign, right? It's, of course, if they have questions, they should be able to get documents. But you can have these open-ended requests for things that nobody has or can be hard to track down, that are totally irrelevant to the actual legitimacy of the vote. And again, it's really about delay.
It is. And we know exactly what Trump will do if he loses Georgia, for example. And if this is still in place, he will stir up more than questions. He can ferment violence, which is really the concern of us. And my grave concern really is, Noah, that, in places where, say, Trump is leading early and they keep counting, we know the vote's going to change, that potential violence by some of his supporters at the counting locations to prevent the count. Actually, when he said stop counting in 2020, this time it's people on their own or with a little wink from him trying to physically go in there. I know your report doesn't identify that, but I'm just saying this is one of my concerns. If you can make people go like, well, I have reasonable questions, they won't let me do it. They're forcing me now to certify this illegal fraudulent election, and Trump amplifies that. It can get very ugly.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think even if you have state officials stepping in and enforcing the law, and again, nobody's trying to stop legitimate questions from being litigated. That'll happen. But coming in and saying this county certification is required by law, you've got to do it. Even where that happens, this issue having been raised by these folks, and in Georgia, having been blessed by the State Board of Elections, even if you're successful in sort of tamping it down, it calls the credibility of the election into question for those people who are predisposed to think that the election's not credible. And we saw where that led in 2020. It led to, really horrific violence and a real attack on our democracy. And unfortunately, the people who are behind those efforts are more organized. They are doing this kind of thing in advance. And there's really the potential for a repeat or worse if we are not really aggressive in getting out in front of it. And I think where Georgia is scary is that you have these state officials who are doing the opposite, who are potentially laying the groundwork for this. We saw last week, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who had been pretty quiet, actually came out and said, we expect the counties to certify.
Yep.
And so maybe there are some more positive steps happening. We certainly hope so.
Yeah, I mean, there was reporting today Governor Brian Kemp might be trying to pressure them as well. And we'll
Yeah.
see where that goes. It was reported in the Atlantic Journal, AJC down in Georgia. I'm chatting with Noah Bookbinder, president of CREW, about their new report, Election Certification or Threat. Now, the good news is if people want to read the report, first, it's free. You can see it online. But you list a lot of legal remedies in each state very specifically. And I imagine you did that on purpose to flag it for campaigns. Do you know offhand if the Harris-Walz campaign, I'm sure they have a team of lawyers, but that they're aware of these threats as well? We because it used to be, honestly, you put your effort in to get out the vote. Now it's the idea of don't count the vote or ignore the vote or return the vote. Like I can't believe these are the discussions we actually have to have now because that's the concerns. But are you aware if and you're not a partisan organization, but are you aware of Democratic Party figures, leaders being aware of the legal issues here?
I mean, obviously, we are, as you said, we're a nonpartisan organization. We can't be and aren't, working in
Sure.
cooperation with political campaigns. But I think the first thing that we are trying to make sure is that state officials are aware of these remedies, so that they can, in the first instance, act quickly to go to court. We certainly, part of the idea too was to put this out to the public so that regular people are aware, and so that everybody who's part of the process, whether that be candidates or campaigns or officials or just concerned citizens, understands what the options are, what the law allows, and what the law requires.
Absolutely. And I think it's so valuable. The minute I saw it, I'm like, oh, we have to have Noah or someone else from CREW on to talk about this in detail. What else are you concerned about at CREW in terms of the actual process of voting and counting the votes between, in this 2024 election, which is only a little over 70 days away from ending?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are a couple of things. And one of the things is that we already see Donald Trump and others out there saying, essentially, if I don't win, it's going to be because it was rigged. And that can have a number of really negative effects. It can cause people to decide that they're not going to vote because they feel like either they're intimidated or they feel like the results are in question or preordained, and some of it, some of this kind of discussion, I think, it may well be aimed at suppressing the vote. But then, we also need to look at all of the steps. One of the things that we saw in 2020 and into 2021 was a sort of effort to find all the vulnerabilities in our system of certification and of counting and ultimately of determining the winner. And so, this county certification is one of the first steps, and it's a really important one. But then you have certification by the state. In some cases, that's a legislature. In some cases, it's the executive. You have the electoral college itself, where a slate of people come in and vote. You have Congress, and Donald Trump in 2020 and 2021 tried to push on a number of those levers. The Electoral Count Reform Act, which Congress passed a couple of years ago, that will help a little bit on the final piece of that, on the congressional piece, to some extent on the Electoral College, but there's still a lot of moving pieces and a lot of vulnerabilities in there, and we have to assume that some of these same folks are thinking through what those are, and we got to be ready to move legally if there are any attempts to gum up the works.
Oh, I can assure you they're plotting away. Instead of working on issues and get the vote out, they're doing the back end, which is deeply concerning. No, if people want to find out more about CREW, it's Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Where can they go?
We're online at citizensforethics.org. We're also, on, I want to say Twitter. I guess it's now called X, at Citizens for Ethics. Actually, it's there. We're at CREW. We're on Threads at Citizens for Ethics, and we are, really trying to get ahead of the democracy issues that may be coming to us this fall and into next year. And so, keep an eye on those spaces. We're going to be, we have that report. We've got a couple of others coming out about some major threats and hopefully what we can do about them.
Wow. Well, CREW, you have done so much great work at CREW. I've cited you in articles for years now on ethics stuff and on voting. I look forward to chatting with you and reading more scary reports for you now on election day, and maybe we'll discuss them with you or others at CREW as we go on. But thanks so much for your time, Noah.